Some medical professionals are advocating a high-fat, low-carbs diet, okay, which goes against government guidelines.
So, yes, currently we're advised that when it comes to eating fat, no more than 10% of our daily calories should come from saturated fat. So who is right? Is any fat good for us? And if so, which type?
So can you trust experts when it comes to eating fat? That's what Katie and I want to know from you. 08085 909 693 is the number. Calls are free from mobiles and landlines, and you can text 85058. Hugh Pym is our health editor and joins us now. Hugh, good afternoon.
Hi, Nahal. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
Tell us how public health attitudes to fat have changed over the last few decades, because you and I are just, well, we're young, of course, but we do remember when it was just low fat, low fat, low fat, low fat. Fat is evil.
I'm certainly not nearly as young as you two, so I'll have to go back a long time. But I think public opinion's been possibly slightly driven by what experts are saying. And I think, as your debate is going to reveal, there are differences in expert opinion. For many years, it was standard practice to say to people, cut your fat intake because you need to cut your cholesterol and so on, and go for a low-fat diet. But in the last few years, we've had more and more publicity about sugar and carbohydrate, and I think it is pretty confusing for people. So public opinion needs to be led by expert opinion, but expert opinion hasn't always come to clear conclusions. Now, the latest guidance officially, which is disagreed with by some experts, is, as you've just heard, that saturated fat should be 10% of your total calorie intake. Now, that was the guidance going all the way back to 1994, but just in the last week, a new consultation paper has gone out from the Expert Advisory Committee saying that they don't want to change that guideline, they want to stick with it.
So, Hugh, what is the message from government, say the NHS now? What are they saying is the best way to go?
Well, if you stick to the advice from Public Health England, which is the official advice, I spoke to them actually just an hour or so ago, and they said, well, if you look at this new consultation paper from their Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition called SACN, they are saying stick with the guidelines. There's no change. They still think there is a lot of merit in cutting saturated fat in your diet and keeping it to that limit, 30 grams for men, no more than 20 grams for women, and less for children each day. In other words, even with all the debate about sugar, stick with that guidelines. Now, stick with those guidelines. Now, that will be obviously contested by some who feel that sugar is a lot more important. And actually, Public Health England themselves have got policies on sugar reformulation, and we've had a sugar levy recently, so maybe some in authority are recognising that the issue of sugar is very important as well as saturated fat.
And it seems that the subject of sugar, I mean, people know that there's a problem with it, but it doesn't seem to be tackled at the level that perhaps it should be. And there's also confusion around which fats are good, because obviously eating a load of fried food and chips is not the same as eating good quality fat, is it?
Yes, you've got the issue around unsaturated and saturated fat, and unsaturated might be oily fish, certain types of oil, certain nuts. That's seen as a very positive dietary selection, whereas saturated fat in processed food like sausages, burgers, fatty meat, some dairy products is the sort of thing which the official guidelines are to cut back on. Then you've got trans fats, which are these specially produced oils used in some fried foods and some margarine traditionally. They were seen as really bad, but the food industry has cut right back on those, and actually in the UK, consumption of those trans fats is pretty low compared with many other countries.
Why is it so hard, Hugh, for the government and others to carry out research in this area?
Well, I suppose they'd say that it needs to have conclusive research. You need to study a lot of people over a very long period. Yeah. But you've got experts who say that actually the debate was wrong in the first place, that fat and cholesterol was the wrong way to go, and that actually it was sugar and carbohydrate which was causing the problem because of the impact on insulin and what that means in terms of type 2 diabetes. So you've got a genuine difference of opinion, and maybe some very long-term research would be a good thing, but that'll take time. But certainly there is consensus, even in official circles, that sugar is not a good thing for anyone's diet in the sort of quantities people have been taking on board. Therefore, you need companies to cut back on their sugar content, and we've had this sugar levy on soft drinks. Some will say that's not nearly enough. The sugar reformulation plan is voluntary. Companies are not being forced to cut sugar. Maybe there should be more mandatory measures there.
Hugh, thank you. Hugh Pym there, our health editor. Now, one of the reasons we're talking about this today is because of my guest co-presenter. Now, I mentioned, if you were listening at around 12:59:30, you would know that I mentioned to someone who would carry around a Tupperware little box, rectangular box, with butter in it.
Grass-fed, good quality butter.
Now, that has nothing to do with bread.
It has very little to do with bread, absolutely. So as we were discussing, my lifestyle is pretty mental. It's chaotic. I need a lot of energy. I'm not getting any younger. The work stays just as hard. I've tried lots of different types of diets because I've also got to keep in good shape. I want to look good, but I certainly want to feel good, and I'm working crazy hours. So I need to make sure that my diet is feeding that lifestyle. I tried going pescatarian. I called it aquavore. I thought that sounded much cooler.
It's much cooler.
I tried going veggie for a while. Then I discovered paleo, which is a sort of the caveman diet. And I've finally come to this very high fat, no sugar, very low carb diet. I follow one called the Bulletproof, but obviously there are many diets that you could follow. But I have, the mainstay of that diet as well is that you have, for breakfast, you have very high grade coffee full of butter and what's called MCT oil. It's very refined coconut oil, but it's at 75% of your calories that you're getting in the day are from fat.
So you, just to be clear, make a cup of coffee and just lob a
very large knob of butter in it and whisk it up. That's me brekkie.
And then
delicious, by the way, absolutely delicious.
Okay, 85058 is the text number, because I want to know, and Katie wants to know, if you feel you can trust experts when it comes to eating fat, and whether you are on this diet, this high fat, low carb diet. And just give us, how long have you been on this now?
I've been on this since October, and I have lost nearly a stone. I've got way better muscle tone. I don't go to the gym a lot. I go maybe once a week at most. I'm active. I do my show.
Yeah, of course.
But it's been totally transformative for me.
And what about cravings?
The fat. Basically, I've been addicted to sugar my whole life. My nickname as a kid was Katie Custard in my house. And I have been a slave to sugar my whole life. I never felt full. I'd eat a huge meal, and unless I had pudding, I just didn't feel satisfied. I'd always have cravings. I'd want snacks and all this stuff. But once you take the sugar out of the diet, the fat really completely knocks out any cravings. And the best way to think of it is the body is like a hybrid car. So if you put sugar in it, it's going to run on sugar. It'll always choose the sugar because it wants to store the fat in case you aren't able to hunt a leopard.
Yes, yeah.
And
I find that really hard.
This is a bad day when that happens.
Yeah.
But when
they told me actually there would be a bigger leopard population up here than there actually was when I got up here.
They just sell you these lies. I mean, it's a shame. Sorry, now. I must be very disappointed.
Anyway,
but you cut the sugar out, your body will immediately flip over to running on fat, and it runs on fat very efficiently. And you can literally have a bowl of broccoli and cover it in butter and lose weight.
Let's speak to some experts. Dr. Aseem Malhotra is a consultant cardiologist and author of The POP Diet. Professor Susan Jebb is Professor of Diet and Population Health at Oxford University, and Tracy Parker is Senior Dietitian at the British Heart Foundation. Good afternoon to all three of you.
Hello. Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nihal.
Professor Jebb, can I start with you? I mean, growing up, it was all about low fat, and fat and cholesterol were the enemy. The idea that you would put a tablespoon full of butter into your coffee in the morning, people just thought it was a joke. What do you think of this high fat, low carb regime?
Oh, lots of questions all in there.
Yeah,
I don't
really.
think we would be recommending anybody to add that much butter to their diet. But if you like that, that's what you want to do, that's your personal choice. I think we need to be realistic about the differences between the total amount of fat in the diet and the saturated fat. So, as Hugh said earlier, our concerns in terms of health are about saturated fat. But we can be reasonably relaxed about other kinds of fat. So things like nuts or avocados contain lots of fat, but they're really healthy foods. They're unsaturated fats. So yes, we should be cutting down on saturated fat, but of course we should be cutting down on sugar too. And in the same way that there are some good carbohydrates, the sort of high fiber, whole grain grains, there are some bad carbohydrates like sugar, and there are some good fats like unsaturated oils, rapeseed oil, olive oil, etc. And there are some bad fats like saturated fat. So I think, it is a little bit nuanced, but we have never in the UK actively said low fat. People have about a third of all of their calories from fat. That's not a low-fat diet. If you're talking about a low-fat diet...
Sorry, the food industry certainly has sold us low-fat, 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 and that must have come from somewhere.
They have, but actually...
Did that not come from medical advice?
Nobody's taken any notice of it, because actually the UK consumes about a third of its calories from fat.
But then, is that the case that while pursuing a low-fat diet, we have ignored the carbohydrates?
I think we have to some extent, though. In fact, sugar intakes haven't changed all that much over time. They're too high. Arguably, they always were too high, but they haven't actually changed all that much. The problem we have in the UK is the great gap between recommendations and what people actually do. So it's been very, very difficult to shift dietary behaviours, in fact. So that's why we still have too much saturated fat and we still have too much sugar in our diets.
But I think also that what Nihal was saying about the low fat, I mean, I grew up with that. And it certainly put into the minds of the public that fat was bad. So even if people are choosing to eat fat, they feel like they're doing something wrong.
Perhaps it did, but what we need to do now is to really help people understand the difference between different types of fats. And so I have no real worry about people having more unsaturated fat in their diet, assuming that they're not overweight, because all fats contain calories, of course. But once you've got your calorie balance right, then actually unsaturated fats are fine, and there are lots of healthy foods which are rich in unsaturated fats. But I do still worry about saturated fat. And it's not just the UK Committee on Nutrition that's recently said, yes, we think our advice is correct. No more than 10% of your calories from saturated fat. But interestingly, the World Health Organization has also just recently reissued its guidance, and they too have said, yes, 10% really should be the maximum. There is very good evidence that if you look at hundreds of thousands of people, whole populations, on average, those who have a high saturated fat diet have more heart disease.
What would you say to the National Obesity Forum report? It came out a couple of years ago, which argued actually that eating a diet rich in full-fat dairy, such as cheese, milk and yogurt, can actually lower the chance of obesity?
Well, I'd suggest that they look at all the evidence. What that report did, and I think was shown very clearly at the time, is to do what we call cherry picking. So they find a study which supports their cause. But what the expert reviews have done, the SACN committee and that World Health Organization committee, is they do what we call a systematic review. So they try to set out at the beginning, this are the studies we'll look for. We'll search the whole literature, we'll find them all, and then we'll analyse them in their totality. And when you do that, what you see is that there is a clear effect that too much saturated fat in your diet increases health risks.
Dr. Aseem Malhotra is a consultant cardiologist and author of The Piopi Diet. Welcome, Dr. Aseem Malhotra.
Hi, Katie.
And what do you have to say on this?
It's very interesting what Professor Jeff says. I agree with a lot of what she says generally. I think that the main issue is processed food. Ultra-processed food is the consumption in the average British diet is close to about 50%. And interestingly, when you look at that, most of that ultra-processed food is made up of starch, sugar, ultra-processed fruit and vegetables, about 77% of that, not so much from fat. But just coming back to what Professor Jebb said about the totality of evidence, I completely agree with her. The trouble is, it appears that the government guidelines, SACN, WHO, don't appear to actually be using the totality of the evidence. So last year, myself and two very eminent cardiologists, all practicing cardiologists, by the way, one is editor of JAMA Internal Medicine, Professor Rita Redberg in America, and Pascal Meyer, who's editor of Open Heart. We actually wrote an editorial, which was the most read of any BMJ, British Medical Journal paper last year, saying saturated fat does not clog the arteries, and actually the way to combat heart disease and many of these chronic conditions that are plaguing the Western world is through healthy lifestyle changes. But one of the things we looked at was systematic reviews of all the evidence basic from observational studies, but also used sort of more robust evidence for people with heart disease. And what we found is if they cut their saturated fat, it had absolutely no effect or benefit on heart disease risk whatsoever. So my concern is actually these guideline bodies don't appear to be using all the evidence. Now, how can we explain all of that? Let's put a bit of context here. As a doctor, my responsibility is to my patients and scientific integrity. The father of what we call the evidence-based medicine movement, so somebody who was sort of the brainchild behind how we should best practice medicine, he said 50% of what you learn in medical school will turn out to be either dead wrong or outdated within 5 years of your graduation. The trouble is, nobody can tell you which half you have to learn on your own. So the science has evolved, but the other issue as well, and I think we have to accept this as a reality, is there is a multi-billion-dollar industry that profits from the fear of fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. And I think that eventually we will get to a point where people will stop thinking so much about saturated fat, and really just what we should be doing is just concentrate on eating real food. Now, when you look at the epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes is probably the single biggest cost on the NHS at the moment. About 10% of all the expenditure on the NHS goes into type 2 diabetes. And this is a condition which is predominantly of carbohydrate intolerance. Now, Professor Jebb is absolutely right. There are different types of carbohydrates. I'm talking specifically about the heavily processed, the starches, the sugars, the bread, the pasta, that kind of thing. And in my own patients as a practicing doctor, I see remarkable transformations in people coming off their medications, people reversing or taking their type 2 diabetes into remission just after months of changing their diet, which has predominantly cut out the processed carbohydrates. So I think, if we cut processed foods out of the diet predominantly and just go back to eating real food and stop this obsession and focus with saturated fat and cholesterol, I think the whole population will be a lot healthier a lot more quickly.
Let's bring Tracy Parker in, who's Senior Dietitian at the British Heart Foundation. What do you make of what you've just heard Dr. Asim Malhotra say?
I think what this highlights is that nutrition science is very complex, and it can't always be fit into similar black and white boxes. But coming from a sort of a heart and circulatory disease perspective, I think it's really important that we have to remember that eating well to improve your heart health is not just about the fats we eat. We know that there are many factors that affect our cardiovascular disease risk. So that is your blood cholesterol, your blood pressure, whether you're overweight, have diabetes. And we know that not one food or nutrient alone will reduce that risk. So the key thing here, I think, is we've got to move away from sort of demonizing one nutrient or another and start to think about healthy diets in the form of foods. And that's, we all eat foods, we don't eat nutrients. And recommendations have changed, over the years, and are recognising the importance of looking at the whole diet on your risk for cardiovascular disease rather than just to focus on single dietary changes.
Sorry, Tracy, to interrupt you, but the problem is, of course, and this is why our question is based on experts, is that this isn't just an evolution of a conversation you've been having. It's a complete opposite of what we were told growing up about fat and cholesterol.
And there also isn't really a demonization of these processed carbohydrates. They're very, very pushed and very, it's a mainstay of a family diet.
Billions of pounds of advertising.
If these are the foods, and we are in an obesity epidemic, there's no getting away from it. It's getting worse.
Can I just come in there? I think Katie's absolutely spot on. I mean, we keep hearing this stuff in the news about, we need to cut fat, sugar, and salt. I think really the main issues, the main problems that we need to focus on is really starch, sugar, and vegetable oils, the industrial vegetable oils that people are consuming as well. I mean, I've looked at a lot of data on this, and when people heat these vegetable oils up, and talking about fish and chips, that kind of thing, they produce these toxic compounds called aldehydes, which have been strongly linked to cancer and dementia and heart disease. So the problem is really the junk food and the processed food. And I think if we just all agreed on that first and foremost, then actually we'd be better off. The other thing, just to comment about cholesterol, and that's interesting because that science is evolving as well. And I was involved in some original research that was published in the BMJ in 2016. And what we found was if you're over 60, what people perceive to be the so-called bad cholesterol, LDL, there was no association with heart disease. And what we found, which is, I didn't even expect this, we found that there was an inverse association with mortality. What does that mean? The higher LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, the less likely you were to die. And the explanation for that is cholesterol is such a complex vital molecule in the body. One of its roles is also in the immune system. Elderly people are vulnerable to infections, pneumonia. So actually there's a whole evolution with cholesterol as well. And I think we've actually wrongly focused on cholesterol. Tracy would agree with me and knows this. People with very extreme levels of very high cholesterol, there is a much larger proportion of heart disease in those patients called familial hyperlipidemia. And we know from genetic studies that people who have genetically low cholesterol have less heart disease. But actually they also have low blood pressure as well. So it's difficult to tease it out. But for the majority of the population, and I say this to my patients all the time, and you talk to somebody that's treated tens of thousands of people with heart disease in his career, we need to stop fearing cholesterol so much and look at the overall pattern of what's going to make people healthy from a heart disease perspective. And finally, just one more point I'll make. When you look at the different risk factors for heart disease, the number one risk factor is something called insulin resistance. So basically your body becomes resistant to the hormone insulin over time. That's the number one risk factor. But the reason most people don't know that is there's no market for that message. There's never been a real drug that's been effective in combating insulin resistance. But the good news is this. To combat insulin resistance, it's basically a diet which is low in processed foods, specifically processed carbohydrates, movement, so, not sitting for prolonged periods of time, reducing your stress levels, getting a good sleep. And if you do all of that, then really, potentially 80% of cardiovascular disease would be eradicated.
I'm going to jump back into the fat chat and bring back in Professor Susan Jebb.
Professor Jebb, are you with us?
I am indeed.
Oh,
Yes.
brilliant.
Here I am.
Let's bring you back in.
Listening quietly.
You listened to Dr. Asim Malhotra speak about cholesterol and of course these are complex issues, but of course we're not all to the level of science that you two are at. So
let me make it a bit
humanise it if you could for us.
Well, the biggest issue we've got, and the reason why we've got so much heart disease, so much diabetes, and indeed quite a lot of cancers, is because people are overweight. And 2/3 of adults in Britain are overweight. Now, if you want to manage your weight or lose weight, you've got to eat fewer calories. Sure, that means eating less sugar. It also probably means eating less fat too, because fat's got calories as well. Now, once you've got your weight sorted out, then you've probably got a little bit more flexibility in your diet to have the kind of diet you like. So if Katie loves having butter in her coffee, who am I to stop her? But I wouldn't recommend that for most people. Maybe try a handful of nuts instead, because then you get all the calories, you get that energy boost.
In her coffee?
No, with your coffee.
Oh, right, okay.
You get the calorie boost, you're getting a bit of protein, you're getting some fibre, you're getting some micronutrients, and you're getting the fat. You're getting unsaturated fats, though, which in general we think are better for your health. The other thing that Asim said, which, really, even as a nutrition scientist, I wish we could get away from talking about nutrients, talk about the foods that people buy when they go to the supermarket, when they go to a cafe or to a restaurant. That's food. I think we're all agreed that biscuits, cakes, chocolate confectionery are kind of, maybe they're treats, but treats mean occasionally, not every single day. So let's try to strip some of those out of our diets. That way you'll take away sugar, you'll take away some fat, and you'll take away a lot of extra calories that most of us don't need. And then when we're talking about meals, of course, who's going to argue against having more fresh foods, having more vegetables with our meals? Of course, that's a good idea.
But not fruit.
Well, you can have a bit of fruit if you like. It has got quite a lot of sugar in it. It's got carbs in it. I'm relaxed about fruit, to be perfectly honest, in the grand scheme of things.
Fruit juices?
Well, not juices, because then you can glug down God knows how much. Eat intact fruit. Again, fruit juice is just highly processed. Get away from the processed food. Try to get back to fresh, healthy foods. And That's easily said. I think most people would agree with it. The challenge is, how do we support people to make that change? Because when you're busy and you're rushing and you've not got time and you're stressed, you want something convenient, and all the convenience things that are around, all the things the adverts are telling you to eat, are generally highly processed, high fat, high sugar, high calorie things.
And I think the thing that we haven't discussed as well, Professor Jebb, is that sugar is arguably as addictive as cocaine. So it's easy enough to tell people, you shouldn't have cakes and you shouldn't have biscuits too often, but we're eating a processed food that is actually making our bodies crave more and more and more of it.
Well, it's not really the sugar that's, if you like, addictive. What we mean is it's very, very palatable. Mostly people would say it's chocolate. People don't crave sugar in a sugar bowl.
There's definitely some controversial thoughts on that, because the reading that I've done is that
from the sugar bowl, people crave particular foods like chocolates or pasta or bread. Those are foods. They're not individual nutrients.
Well, the reading that I've done...
Do you crave bread in the same way you would crave a chocolate bar?
The reading that I've done, a lot of it is to do with the gut flora, and the bad bacteria that live in the gut flora crave sugar.
Well, the bad bacteria that live in your gut eat all sorts of things, and the best way of actually squeezing them out is to get more of the good bacteria. Now, what good bacteria like is fibre, and fibre mostly comes from carbohydrates, but the fibre-rich kind of carbohydrates, and from fruits and vegetables.
But surely vegetables would be a better source of fibre than processed carbohydrates.
Of course, not necessarily. They've got fewer calories. They're different. You've got to get calories from somewhere. Very few people are going to be able to eat enough broccoli to get by on the day. So you've got to get calories from somewhere.
Which is why I cover it in butter.
Well, you do, but what I'm suggesting would be better would be to get those calories instead from other things which also have other valuable nutrients, like unrefined carbohydrates, or things like nuts, for example, or avocados. They may have some fat in them, but it's the healthier fats.
Yes, and that definitely they're things that I do enjoy as well because of that reason.
Dr. Malhotra, come back in.
You made some really important points there. I think the first thing to say is you can tell people to eat less, but you can't tell them to stop feeling hungry.
Yeah.
And one of the problems we've had is a lot of these processed foods, which seem to be driven more by, and there is good scientific evidence about how processed carbohydrates in particular affect appetite control mechanisms. And Katie talked about it earlier, she was and by the way, I was one of those people as well. I mean, I calculated I probably used to consume close to maybe 40 teaspoons of sugar a day.
Wow.
And
that's,
I think,
just for average Asian intake, that's pretty low, I think. If you go anywhere near an Asian sweet shop, good grief.
Well, what's a can of Coke is what, 16?
It's about 9.
It's about 9.
It's about half a laddu.
But basically what I found and what was normal for me was always hungry. So I'd have my sugared cereal in the morning, I'd have my chocolate bar, mid-morning, and then I'd have my lunch, then I'd have the crash after a high-carb panini meal or pasta. And that was a constant thing for me. And actually, that I think that's really crucial to people consuming less. But there's another thing that we need to add in there, which is the elephant in the room. There's no such thing as a healthy weight. It doesn't exist. It's complete nonsense. It's unscientific nonsense. You can have a very unhealthy weight, but up to about 40% of people with a normal body mass index, not overweight even, will still harbor the same sort of metabolic abnormalities, whether it's related to heart disease or type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, as people with obesity. So there's no such thing as a healthy weight. And you look at insulin resistance, that starts before people become overweight or obese. So what I focus on and what I wrote about is actually what we should be focusing on is health, not weight. But actually as a side effect, when people focus on healthy patterns of diet or lifestyle, then as a side effect the weight comes off, but more importantly it's about the health conditions related to it. Because obesity itself is not a problem if it wasn't for the health conditions related to it.
The gentleman that texted in earlier, it was interesting, he said, I'm having a can of Coke and a bacon roll before going to the gym. But does that really work? Because you're still doing damage to your body by eating those things.
Katie is spot on. You can't outrun a bad diet. And we published something in British Journal of Sports Medicine 2015, which is widely publicised. And of course, nutritional science is, it's not perfect, but certainly there's a suggestion that if you're normal body mass index and you consume too much sugar, you're still increasing your risk of type 2 diabetes. And lots of examples of people that, have run marathons and, and developed type 2 diabetes because they were consuming too much sugar and processed carbohydrates. So I think we need to just focus on health. Obviously, weight is important, but actually focus foremost on health, and then the weight issue will resolve itself automatically.
Well, talking to the texter who was sitting in the car eating a bacon roll and drinking a can of Coke, hope you're still listening. He has had a response from Nick in London who said, in contrast to your last texter, I completely support the so-called nanny state, whatever that means. If people can't be trusted to spend their money wisely and not on sugar-infested junk, then what choice does the government have but to do it for them? Nanny state equates to helping people live longer, healthier lives. Why on earth would anyone be against it, says Nick in London. Laura in Wiltshire says, your current debate with several experts highlights the problem for us mere mortals. The experts can't agree on what causes obesity. So what and who do we believe? Personally, common sense will prevail, says Laura in Wiltshire. And Tracy, that is a text that has been repeated a number of times. We, us mere mortals, are constantly presented with experts, professors and doctors who confuse the hell out of us.
I think you're right, but I think there's also consensus with the three of us in terms of we need to be focusing more on healthy diets and the foods that we should be eating more of. And that, and there's some of the foods that we're not. So, fruits and vegetables, we're not meeting the 5-a-day recommendation. We need to be choosing healthier fats, nuts and grains, rather than the processed foods that Asim is talking about, that is prolific in our diets. So we need to look at our whole diet and eating patterns, and that's where there's a whole load of great research, particularly around the Mediterranean diet, showing that healthy lifestyle, so what you're eating, you're exercising, who you're eating with, how long you're eating, how long it takes to eat, all these factors, help in terms of having healthy lifestyles that affect all sorts of chronic disease. So not just things like cardiovascular disease, but cancers, your weight, and diabetes. And I think as a collaborative group of health professionals, that's what the message needs to keep coming across, to keep the message simple to the to the public, so that we're not seen to be at odds with each other.
Dr. Asim Malhotra, I know, has to leave us now, so thank you, Dr. Malhotra.